It's great to see you all. Thanks so much for being here. So I'll start by acknowledging that we're situated today and gathered here together on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And it's my absolute pleasure to get to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Meridith Griffin. So a little bit about Meridith. Dr. Griffin's an associate professor in the Department of Health, Aging and Society at McMaster University. And while she's not currently on the West Coast, she does share some history with us in the School of Kinesiology. So Meridith started with an undergraduate degree in kinesiology at McMaster, and then she moved here to do her MA in the School of Kin with Dr. Brian Wilson at the time. And then after that, moved to Exeter in the UK to complete a PhD and a postdoctoral fellowship. So in her work, Dr. Griffin examines the embodied lived experiences of physical activity and active leisure participation across the life course. And at the crux of her work, she's really interested in understanding how and why people make choices to engage or not in movement and health-related behaviors. She takes a critical approach to her work, so she draws on theorizing from social gerontology, the sociology of sport and physical activity, leisure studies, and social psychology, and she employs various different qualitative methodologies. That includes participatory, ethnographic, narrative, and visual and arts-based methods also. So Dr. Griffin has many accolades, of course. She's published several outstanding articles in venues, including qualitative research in sport, exercise, and health, aging and society, sport, education, and society, only to name a very few. She's consistently received several sources of national level funding for her work. She's been the director of the Gilbrea Center for Studies in Aging at McMaster, and also instrumental in developing community research partnerships at McMaster. And this has included a few examples of holding the role of scholar in community, working with the Hamilton Public Library and the YMCA. She's also a member of MIRA, which is the McMaster Institute for Research on Aging, and collaborator with the Moving Bodies Lab associated with the Discovery Research Platform for Medical Humanities at Durham University. So I came to know Meridith first through her work before we met in person. And I remember as a master's student thinking, oh, Griffin published something new, this is going to be good. And then I got to meet her in person, and over the past few years, I've had the absolute privilege of getting to know Meridith not only as a scholar, but as a person through our research collaborations together on queer aging and physical activity. And what I've come to realize very quickly with Meridith is not only how wonderful of a scholar she is, her theoretical prowess is unmatched, which you'll hear about today, and I've learned a tremendous amount from her. But what makes Meridith special is her thoughtfulness and her teamwork. So Meridith is a team player in and through, probably related to her past as a stellar soccer player. And she's generous with her ideas, she's generous with her time, and she's really dedicated to collaboratively bettering our understanding of physical culture with absolutely no ego involvement. She just really wants to make the world a better place for everyone. And the thing you need to know about Meridith as well is that she's someone who only speaks when she has something important to say. So she's that scholar that sits back, she observes, she listens, and then when she says something, it's exceptional, and you know you should listen. So based on what I've come to know about Meridith over the last few years, I wanted to learn a little bit more about and share with you what others who've had the privilege of working closely with Meridith had to say about her. So I reached out to a few of her colleagues, past supervisors as well, and our own Dr. Laura Hurd, I think, put it perfectly. She said, when Erica reached out to me to ask if I would share a sentence or two about Meridith, I immediately thought of how smart, kind, multi-talented, and wickedly funny she is. And also that she would absolutely hate having any of us say such, albeit wonderful, things about her, given her humble and unassuming nature. Dr. Brett Smith, who's a professor at Durham University, had something very similar to say. He said, Meridith's an increasingly rare type of scholar. Rather than mass social media campaigns about her research or loud self-promotion at conferences, Meridith lets the quality of her research do the work. And what quality? Since I first met Meridith over 15 years ago, I've been continuously impressed with her outstanding intellect and the research she cares so much about. And then finally, our own Dr. Brian Wilson had this to say. It became remarkably clear when Meridith was an MA student at UBC several years ago that we had a high-end thinker, researcher, and writer in our midst who was incredibly modest, we see a theme here, about these skills. In fact, I still remember reading a draft of Meridith's thesis while taking the bus to UBC about 20 years ago. I really do remember. Even saying I remember where I was when I read Meridith's thesis should tell you something about the high quality and impact of Meridith's work right from the start. So as you can see, there's a theme here, humility, and someone who is unassuming. So I had the awesome job of boasting for Meridith. So that's the best job. So that's enough for me. I think those messages say it all. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Griffin to the stage. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here as well. It's really nice to see you. And I'm really pleased to be here. I'm really pleased to get to talk a little bit about my work and this project I've been working on for the last 4 years. So Erica did a little land acknowledgement, but I think important to say that I'm here from Hamilton, Ontario, which was once named Adirondack by the Adirondack or neutral peoples. And I work at McMaster, which is on the traditional territory of a few nations, including the Mississaugas, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples. As my brief bio and what Erica just spoke about, in my research program, I often take a life course approach to understand how and why people make choices to engage or to not engage in movement-related pursuits, as well as other health-conscious behaviors. And I suppose I've primarily focused on non-elite physical activity participation, how we might, imaginatively and maybe creatively make physical activity spaces welcoming, accessible, inclusive to more people across the life course. And in doing this, I've focused on embodied experiences, how they're influenced by various socio-demographic characteristics, including a lot of my work's been on gender, age, sexuality, body size, disability, and so on. But I've done most of this work from a biographical perspective. So listening to the stories that people tell about themselves and about their bodies, and the social and the cultural context that they're telling those stories within. And so just to share a few examples, I've looked at experiences of folks that participate in women's only sporting environments. I've done some work on embodied learning, so what it's actually like to take up and learn new physical activities in mid and in later life. I'm doing some work right now with some colleagues on environmental activism and movement and intergenerational relationships therein. So looking at plogging, like picking up litter and jogging, or pliking, picking up litter and hiking, and what those experiences are like and what they can teach us. And also work with colleagues like Dr. Bennett on movement and menopause, which we've been doing a little bit of work on this week while I've been here. So today I'm going to talk to you about a project I've been working on since 2021 that's now just about coming to a close. This is my multi-phased SSHRC-funded project called Physical Activity for Any Body. I framed this as a collaborative ethnography and appreciative inquiry, and it's a project within which I aim to unpack the relationship between health and/or wellness imperatives, the body positivity movement, sport and physical activity participation, and so-called non-normative bodies, or bodies of difference, as they're often referred to in the literature, defined as bodies that don't conform to the norms of a society or culture on the basis of disability, body size, gender, socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, and so on. This is my team up on the slide. As a multidisciplinary research team, we're drawing from disability justice, queer and fat studies, critical race theory, within the study of leisure and recreation, kinesiology, social work, and social psychology. All of us are cis women settlers with diverse backgrounds. We have varying relationships to queer, thick, disabled, and mad identities, which partially, of course, informs our critical feminist politics that we embrace within our work. We take a difference-affirming orientation, which I hope you can see throughout the work that we're producing, meaning that we see power, identity, culture, and community strengths across racial, disabled, queer, and aging differences. And in doing so, we take up identity-first language. We use terms such as fat, disabled, queer in difference-affirming ways to honor the activist work that's reclaimed those terms. As a team, we're very interested and we're very invested in the meaning of inclusion for both professional and for personal reasons. A little bit about the project. The initial objectives for the project included seeking to advance understanding of the means by which messages about, again, so-called non-normative bodies within physical activity are discursively shaped and communicated through social media and promotional materials. Secondly, examining lived physical activity experiences of those living in or with, again, inverted commas, non-normative bodies. And then increasing stakeholder awareness of this lived consequences of felt exclusivity. How best might we create and nurture inclusive and welcoming spaces and practices for all bodies or for any body? To speak to these objectives, we employed a number of methods, including media and social media analyses, narrative interviews, body mapping, and focus groups. And today I'm going to share some of the insights we've gleaned so far and highlight some of the outputs as well that have come from the project to date. Collectively through this work, we're seeking to understand and ultimately, hopefully, strengthen the facets of physical culture that make them inclusive of all community members in the bodies that they live in. So I'm going to talk through each phase of the project today. You will find I go through some more quickly than others. In any event, I've sought to link to citations if I go through something too quickly for you and you want to read more. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have at the end as well. So way back at the beginning of the project, where did we start? Well, what is inclusion? What is it? What does it look like? EDI, DEI, EDIIS. It's a hot topic, right? In general and within exercise and physical activity spaces and settings in particular, how is it talked about? How is it promised? How is it enacted? We started by looking at websites of fitness organizations and locations in the greater Hamilton area, which promised or which advertised themselves as inclusive. And this paper up on the slide in Leisure Loisir was our first output. It's called Building Community or Perpetuating Inclusionism, the representation of inclusion on fitness facility websites. In it, we found, most fitness facility websites employed rhetoric to at least appear as though they embraced inclusivity and accessibility practices. By rhetoric, we mean language that's designed to have a persuasive effect on its audience, but which ultimately can be interpreted as lacking sincerity. And so organizations demonstrated alignment with a common language of inclusion with consistent claims of being welcoming, empowering, non-judgmental, supportive. But these statements were really rarely contextualized such that a reader might know who the statement applied to and how the statement applied, or how inclusion and accessibility might be nurtured in those spaces. Further, these statements weren't supported with comprehensive accessibility statements or policies. So in this sense, organizations, we argued, could be said to be performing inclusionism. Inclusionism is a disability studies concept coined by David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder. It's sort of an accessibility lip service, signaling desirable intentions via these sort of accessibility inclusion promises, but with little or no substance behind them, nor reference to deliberate actions or substantive structural supports the how, right? It's kind of like having a rainbow sticker on the outside of a shop window, but inside there's no gender inclusive wet bathroom or other practices that might actually enact those promises. For the most part as well, these types of claims weren't evident within the visual representations that were on the websites. Most images showcased, as you'd imagine if you've ever looked up a fitness facility website, white, lean, able-bodied, toned, muscular, relatively young individuals. And in fact, although we found a variety of bodies were found on some websites, and inclusion and accessibility were consistently, although rather opaquely described, disability was almost never visually or textually featured, and fatness was seldom and usually quite problematically represented through a common narrative of weight loss, transformation, before and after pictures, success stories, and so on. When it's only represented in this way, of course, the message is that fatness is acceptable so long as the individual subscribes to weight loss culture, right? And so when organizations claim inclusion for all, but they're not making these systemic changes to alter their ableist, racist, sanist, fat-phobic conditions, it results in inclusionism. This is what we argue in the paper, the welcoming of some bodies under the guise of inclusion, where meaningful and relational commitments are unenacted. In the paper, we argue that inclusion is about creating an affirming space that centers all differences, not just the ones that are convenient, through really explicit and comprehensive methods. And we call for bottom-up approaches to inclusions where the community is what's dictating what's needed, rather than businesses deciding for the community, as an important move, right, to resist neoliberal and capitalist grips on inclusion. Next, we turned our attention to social media movements that have aimed to address inclusion in some way, right? So we first looked at the body positivity movement. So the body positivity movement is the idea that all bodies are good bodies. And it originated as a Black, fat, and queer movement aimed to challenge white, thin, and heterocentric body ideals or beauty ideals. There is some literature that suggests it's been largely co-opted and appropriated, becoming part of the larger wellness industrial complex. But we wondered and we asked how it was being used by folks online. Does it hold any promise in promoting inclusivity, especially in relation to physical activity, movement, fitness, bodily movement of any kind, really? So using a social justice-oriented intersectionality framework, we explored on Instagram how body positivity manifests and is leveraged by certain bodies within physical cultures. How body positivity, as it is associated with movement, subverts or reproduces oppressive body-related logics. And as well, like how the original activist intention of the body positivity movement can be understood or observed today. So we pulled posts using hashtag body positivity, hashtag body positive over a 5-week period, coded these posts for physical activity, really broadly defined, and looked at these posts that we pulled using reflexive thematic analysis to explore the images, the captions, the comments, the associated hashtags that appeared alongside body positivity. In this, we found, first of all, a disclosure privilege of body-related journeys. So there's a tendency to post about weight and bodily transformation amongst, again, primarily white, thin or lean, able-bodied, cisgender folks, mostly through bodybuilding. We had a ton of bodybuilders. Secondly, we found what we called the absent presence. So again, a conspicuous absence of Black, Indigenous, people of color, fat, thick, disabled, 2S LGBTQIA plus people, aging bodies, lack of diversity overall. More than a quarter, in fact, almost half of the posts were selling a product or a service. Be positive about your body by buying this. And then also there were a minority of posts that functioned to resist or refuse or disrupt these more normative posts. With respect to the body positivity movement and its association with physical activity, these findings matter, we argue, because whose bodies are visible and displayed as worthy of being positive about while doing physical activity filters down to messages about who can do physical activity, right? How you should look while you're doing it, what you should buy to get the most out of it. So if mainstream body positivity continues to dominate the social media sphere, and it is everywhere, it's not a stretch to say that this is demotivating at best and discouragingly exclusive at worst, if not traumatic for folks that are not represented therein. So hashtag body positivity on Instagram wasn't it. Where then, if anywhere, we wondered, might folks be going online to engage in body-related activisms as it relates to physical activity participation and engagement? We next used digital ethnography to immerse ourselves in TikTok and find subversive and non-normative content where folks are reclaiming their body and their relationship to physical activity. We created a research TikTok account to use as our main hub to pull examples of posts and to record our field notes. We searched daily and weekly for a set period of time for content that privileged fat, thick, 2S LGBTQIA+, non-binary, disabled, BIPOC content. We began by using hashtags that used very explicit language that helped us to find these spaces. So we noticed that hashtags with very explicit language that calls out an oppressive system, for example, fat phobia, helped to make the algorithm more subversive. We then added creators who aligned with our objective, disliked or liked content depending on whether it aligned with their objective. And this is how we built our algorithm, which we found was a very fluid process that needed constant nurturing. Because if we didn't stay on top of it, more normative and more problematic content started creeping back in. I will point you towards the paper for more detailed findings, including quite a lot of reflections on the app itself and the methods. But in our search for content, we found a genre that we labeled the fringe, which was made by creators who were or who appeared so-called normative, but who were critical of fitness practices and fitness culture. So this included people who proclaimed to be weight neutral, or folks who had worked in the fitness industry, but had realized or felt, become cognizant of its toxic nature, but still who held privilege within those spaces. We found content which we called the circle of surveillance, which consisted of creators particularly across the fat positive community on TikTok, reclaiming surveillance of their bodies as a way to sort of flip the script and speak back to and refuse anti-fat rhetoric. In these posts, the creators were often speaking about a moment that they felt that they were being surveilled under a fat-phobic lens. And then they were challenging that narrative, trying to change that narrative, speaking back to the surveillance by, I felt slightly ironically, creating a new video that would be surveilled. We also consistently observed a tendency for creators to reclaim their body fat, their flesh. So some examples included dancing while grabbing skin and fat around their abdomen, intentionally wearing clothing and displaying that displayed or revealed skin, fat rolls, etc. Pole dancing while shamelessly revealing fat, cellulite, skin, and so on. So overall, we did find community building spaces on TikTok. We also found folks who were pretty critical of the platform and the way it works, the way the algorithm works, but who were finding ways to work with and around this in order to communicate what they wanted to communicate. Overall, we were pretty excited to see some of these more fruitful examples of folks reclaiming their bodies, reclaiming flesh surveillance, maybe even reclaiming the TikTok algorithm itself. We know algorithms are racist, sexist, ableist, and more, what Sophia Noble calls algorithms of oppression. When we started this study, we thought we needed to use this explicit language in order to find, Black, queer, fat, disabled content because of that sort of shared vernacular, so to speak. But now we realize it's a bit more complicated than that. Yes, there's shared language, and that helps you to access these feminist communities online. But it's also because of algorithms of oppression. If you want to see fat content on TikTok, you have to intentionally type that into your search. It's not going to just come up when you're searching for fitness motivation on TikTok. Okay, so by this time, we're getting a bit tired of the online. We wanted to actually talk to some people. And so enters phase 2 of the project, which was narrative interviews. The recruitment poster that we use is up here on the slide. We had a great response. We ended up with 22 participants across Canada. And our participants self-described as Black, person of color, non-binary, neurodivergent, queer, fat, curvy, fluffy. There's some great descriptors in the self-descriptions that came out. Trans, gender fluid, disabled, chronically ill, pansexual, and more. We had an age range of 20 to 67, so quite a big range. And we interviewed these participants about their experiences of both exclusion and inclusion in physical activity and fitness. We used the feminist materialist disability theory of misfitting, described and articulated by Rosemary Garland Thompson to frame this study. So misfitting is the material arrangement of being in an environment where the built and the arranged space offers fits for those who conform to the norm and creates misfits for those who do not. Garland Thompson primarily wrote about this with respect to disability. So what does it mean to fit into fitness? What does it mean to misfit? And it really shifts disability, or we broaden this to embodied difference, from a problem ascribed to the body to a problem of social justice. From this theoretical vantage point, we employed narrative thematic analysis as we thought through and with this really rich interview data. And in doing so, we generated 3 themes. So being a misfit, how the norm is enforced, and choreographing misfitting. So I'm going to talk through each of these with some examples, some quotations. Firstly, though, fitting and misfitting, it denotes an encounter in which 2 things come together either in harmony or in disjuncture. Right? Intersectional feminist and activist Audre Lorde recognized the many layers of normativity and identified what she refers to as the mythical norm, the thin, white, male, young, heterosexual, Christian, and financially secure individual. Participants in our study were keenly aware of these prototypical standards. Many also articulated and recognized being a misfit as a noun, right? As anything beyond the narrow boundaries of the imagined white, able, masculine human. And to misfit, to call out unrealistic or impossible standards of normativity, which I'm going to return to in a minute. So first, being a misfit. Garland Thompson explains that people become misfits via social attitudes and materiality. So it's about how these particularities of embodiment interact with the built environment in both spatial and temporal ways. For Natalie, who is a pansexual, fat, middle-aged, disabled, and gender-fluid white person, being a misfit was about a perceived disconnect between their body and intersecting norms related to body size, gender expression, and ableism in the fitness industry. And she said, fitness is something it's never been a top priority. Spaces just aren't comfortable to me. I knew from when I was very young that to go into a fitness establishment, it was pretty much people that are already fit. And as I got older, it just was not comfortable going into these spaces for fear of being mocked, ridiculed. Emily becomes a misfit by being blind in a sight-centric world. As a sport camp counselor who's legally blind, she preferred to wear her sunglasses indoors. And she said it was kind of this culture where it was like, oh, that's different. You can wear your normal glasses in here. And then they moved to a different facility that had more lighting, and she needed her sunglasses. And she said it was this change that was very negatively received by people. It was, why are you wearing sunglasses? You never wore sunglasses. What's going on, right? And this change was never like, oh, cool, Emily's got rainbow sunglasses on. It was, that's different. That's weird. So being a misfit transcends many categories of what it means to be human. When one is not in very close proximity to normativity, that is the lean, white, cis, able-bodied, and straight, then this disjuncture will be felt deeply and exposes the very mythical standards that preclude bodily expressions, individuality, non-normative movement. Our second theme in this paper looked at how the norm is enforced. So here participants explained how the unattainable mythical norm is often seen or sold as the goal, and as a means of proving worthiness. And they were taught this, they were socialized into this from a very young age. So in their experiences, performing fitness becomes, or seeking to fit, becomes a measure of worthiness and morality associatedly. And it's often pursued as a punitive or disciplinary activity. So Kate, who is a white cis queer woman who identifies as fat, says, I think physical activity was seen as something that had to be done. So you weren't, quote, unquote, lazy. Like it was something where my parents would be like, okay, we need to go do this physical activity. It might have been just walking or a hike, but it was never for joy or exploration. It was always with this undertone of weight management. So those activities never really felt enjoyable. Performative worth for Pat, who was a white, older, cis, straight woman, was about demonstrating physical vigor in fitness classes. And she said, for older people, there's this kind of in-between people like me, like sometimes the Y would have classes they said were for seniors, but they say, oh, you're not really the kind of senior that we're looking for. You know, they want to categorize you, you're not using a walking aid or something like that. So they say, you can't participate in that because you're not old enough, you're not disabled enough, or what have you. So I chose to do classes where people work at quite a fast pace. There's pressure to perform in a class like that. I felt pressured to perform to keep up to what people who are half my age were doing. So exercise thus becomes a way to perform and to measure self-worthiness. And when inevitably it's not possible to engage in physical activity or to attain the mythical norm, worthiness is questioned. Our third theme we called choreographing misfitting. And here we found there's a range of participant responses to being a misfit. Right? So some sought to minimize the discomfort. They sought invisibility, anonymity via either avoidance or masking. And some sought visibility by what we refer to as misfitting loudly, within which there's more of an unapologetic embrace of non-normative movement, And so I'll share some brief examples. Firstly, Carolyn explained, fitness classes, being in the locker room, the change room, always felt uncomfortable. Looking back, I realized that I felt super weird as a queer woman looking and like existing in that space. I'd rather be anywhere else. Fitness is not something I wanted to engage with more. It is something I wanted to engage with more. Felt like I continue to want to do it more, but I feel like gyms and spaces like that aren't really a place I want to go. So for Carolyn, experiencing a misfit was so materially uncomfortable that they avoided spaces and places where it was likely to occur, right? The rationale was that the environment itself was unlikely to change. And so encounters between their body and the world were likely to produce material discomfort, if not, again, trauma. Another response to being a misfit was the attempt to present the material body such that it appeared to fit. So where in certain circumstances, anonymity was the goal, a good enough fit, as Garland Thompson describes, offers material anonymity. A reasonable fit offers relative anonymity. With anonymity becomes privilege, comes social capital. So it's important to note as part of this, though, that the capacity to mask or to appear to fit is both temporal and situational. Only some identities or characteristics are possible to mask. And only in some environments it's easier, some it's harder to hide within. Right? So in this way, not everyone has the same access to choreographing invisibility. Invisible misfitting, such as with respect to race or body size or physical disability, limit and influence the choreography that can take place. Misfitting as an action has agency. It's doing something. It's doing something across time and space, right? It's disruptive because it's a performance and it enacts agency on the misfit. So I would say participants' descriptions of misfitting into equipment or clothing or particular activities resonate with the spatial, the relational, and the temporal nature of Garland Thompson's misfitting theory. She writes that when we experience misfitting and we recognize that disjuncture for its political potential, we expose the relational component and the fragility of fitting. So misfitting thus led some of our participants to demand better fits within fitness culture, advocating for the necessity of attention to, for example, exercise equipment, the built environment of a fitness facility, staff training. Any number of suggestions were made, but some kind of action to change the social, emotional, and physical environment. And participants identified the collective power that loudly misfitting can have. So rather than muting identities, muting varying embodiments, they advocated for making them more visible in order to transform the meanings that they could have. So speaking about the need for justice and belonging to be part of accessibility and inclusion initiatives, Riley explains, particularly when left to my own devices, I don't act normal in public. I move, I make weird noises. So being also maybe belonging would mean I feel free. I feel okay to do that in a gym space, and feeling everyone was super okay with that. In a tangible way, for example, that would be me feeling free to stim or to move or to make weird noises or make weird faces or not communicate well with others, and people being really okay with that. So the central argument really is that this embodied human diversity is a fact of life. More of us are misfits than are those that fit. And misfitting's fragile. If we might fit now, but we're probably going to misfit at some point, right? So it's a fact of life, but this is all but erased with the hyper focus on the mythical norm. So misfitting recenters embodied difference in really vital and really powerful ways. It opens space to reclaim embodied differences and renegotiate relationships within the material world. It's, we argue, a mechanism of social justice. Feminist materialist scholars argue that when it comes to inclusion and to access, instead of attempting to predetermine a body's limits, we should orient toward minimizing constraints and creating a world that maximizes fittings and possibilities for what bodies can become. And this can be done by creating conditions that welcome misfitting loudly, and by centering and valuing embodied differences. The third phase of our project, we turn to some arts-based methods. So I'm going to spend a little bit less time on this phase, but I'll point to a paper that's in progress, hopefully published soon, entitled Physical Leisure for Any Body, Imagining Inclusive Possibilities Through Body Mapping. Body mapping is an arts-based research method used to elicit stories that visually reflect social, political, and economic processes, embodied experiences, and meanings attributed to life circumstances. So participants are generally asked to draw the outline of their bodies onto a large piece of paper and then led or guided through a series of prompts to reflect on their lives and experiences, in our case, with respect to inclusion and exclusion in physical activity. Our participants, who were a sample of interview participants, were 6 people who self-identified as fat, thick, queer, disabled, and/or neurodivergent. And we analyzed our data, which consisted of the narrative interview, as well as the workshop transcripts of the body mapping workshop, and the visual body maps themselves. And we analyzed these using narrative thematic analysis, as well as being informed and influenced by dialogical narrative analysis. In their body maps, through the process of creating it, one of our participants, Casey, described the various tensions they've felt and continue to feel with their body and through their body. So we've described this thematically with the improv phrase, yes, and. Seeking to denote and describe the tensions that exist when we hold 2 opposing or contradictory views or beliefs simultaneously. And Casey first refers to this through their choices or use of colors, speaking about black in juxtaposition with pink, for example, both having different meanings for them, depending on context and depending on affect. Talking about black, they said, but when I think about it, it's simultaneously comforting, but can also signify like a spiral and feeling terrible. Like I feel like it does both. They then outlined their body in black, saying, I wear black a lot to like hide the way I feel about myself. So I do think having it outlined in black is probably, I don't know, the most truthful. The symbol or the image of the black spiral emerged when discussing the internal and the external challenges that Casey faced in physical activity, and the juxtaposition of the coexistence of both oppression and success, existence within those spaces, making progress while still also struggling with both internal and external voices that may limit their beliefs. So by reflecting on and drawing the image or the description of this spiral, Casey denotes that interplay between internal and external challenges and starts to think about some of the ways that they might individually start to defy some of those challenges. For 2 of our participants who were fat, early mid-30s cis women, their message to the general public was firstly from Kate, I'm big and I like being big. And Haley said, I belong here. This is my journey. So through the body mapping sessions, Haley reflected on not only recognizing and accepting the contradictions that we might embody, but also on using them as a source of strength and defiance. Speaking about the power of representation that she shared the positive impact of social media representations for her. She said, I tried to draw on her body map, I tried to draw like nice thighs because I think it sounds like a silly thing to represent it. I've gotten a lot of inspiration from gals on Instagram and they just have like the thickest thighs. And I think that's so beautiful because it's always been something that's been pointed out to me, I've been insecure about, but they're just like thriving with thick thighs and they just own it. It's a place of support. So purposely pushing back on the negative connotations associated with larger thighs to not only exist, but to thrive is something that really resonated with Haley. Further, in the process of thinking about challenges to physical activity, Haley named some of the questions and self-doubt influenced by social structures and past experiences. And by completing her body mapping journey, deeply reflecting on those internal and external strengths, challenges, and so on, supports that her body holds, she arrived at her final defiant message: I belong here. I am evolving. This is my journey. By going through the body mapping process, recognizing, embracing their contradictions, in defying the structural norms that they face, these participants created the path to try and reclaim their joy in pursuit of what we've called their imagined futures. So many spoke about a desire to have or to be part of communities that allow them to be themselves, who they are. They spoke of recollected, joyous, free movement as children and wanted to reclaim that joy through childlike play. So for Carolyn, a hard of hearing, queer, cis woman, physical activity inclusion was about feeling like a kid again, right? She said, I think when I feel like I have access, I feel kind of like a little kid again, whereas a kid, you try whatever you want. You'll fall out of that tree, but it doesn't matter. Like I just feel very free in a way. I'm not constantly worried about everyone looking at me. The freedom is so nice. Carolyn's body map is displayed here on the slide. And she chose to draw her arms raised, kind of like an excited child, raised up in the air, and wrote "play more" really emphatically across her heart area. For Kate, a fat cis woman, physical activity inclusion was, these are my favorite quotations from the whole project, a fat, queer, cool party that centered fat joy. And she wanted to get away from what she referred to as beige millennial wellness culture vibe, and instead talked about the need to be passing the vibe check, right? People being able to be their weirdo self and having an open demeanor towards that. So the concept of queer, crip, Black, fat joy is something that we think holds promise for thinking about what our participants seem to want, what they seem to value with respect to movement. What this means is acknowledging systemic oppression exists. We can keep working against it, but it's unlikely to go away anytime soon. But that joy can simultaneously exist within and alongside that. And perhaps joy and pleasure might be the most powerful forms of resistance and self-care and power. Insistence, if you will, on celebrating our humanity. The final phase, which is still ongoing, we're holding some focus groups with both participants from the interviews and the body mapping sessions, as well as with stakeholders, so those working in the fitness and physical activity industry. And these conversations have been really interesting. In the focus groups, participants shared that they think fitness contexts need a worldview shift, right? Whereby body ideals are rejected, fat, disabled, queer, racialized, trans, older, non-normative lives are celebrated in fitness spaces. So includes refusing the more moral pursuits of exercise, and instead focusing on joy, on connection, holistically. Right? In an initial focus group with nonprofit stakeholders and a preliminary conversation with one for-profit representative, it was shared that considerations of inclusion beyond surface level diversity approaches were daunting for them. So how do we move forward with stakeholder engagement that requires inclusion to be about profit building? What's the business case? Rather than a relational commitment. So these are the types of conundrums that we're grappling with, that we're facing in these stakeholder relationships, and something that we're writing about currently in this paper that we've titled "At What Cost?" Possibilities and conundrums of these relationships. Okay, so I've thrown a lot at you in the last 40-ish minutes. In putting this together, it's really struck me just how big this project has been in trying to sort of synthesize our learnings and starting to think about what comes next. At the outset of the project, I envisioned concluding the project with very tangible, evidence-based toolkit or set of guidelines for inclusion that we co-designed with these lived experts and the stakeholders. And it was really neat and discreet, and we could pass it over to our community organizations, develop best practices, et cetera. We haven't done this. There's lessons, there's things that can be taken up, for sure. But it's not so neat. I think, though, what we have done is that we've started the conversations. What we realize, though, is that these conversations are just that. It's a dialogue. And it needs to be a dialogue that's nurtured over time. And it is a dialogue that is going to have worldview clashes. And what we can do and what we plan to do is to commit to continue having these conversations. So that's it for me. Thank you for your listening ears. I'd also like to thank my research team for all of their efforts, all of their contributions to this work. I think we've got a little bit of time set aside for questions and discussions. So if there's things you don't get to ask or don't think to ask until later, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. My contact info is up there on the slide as well.
Thank you so much, Meridith, for your wonderful talk. So we have about 5 minutes for questions. And if you do have a mic in front of you, you can do the cool thing where you press it and talk through it, because then the folks on Zoom can hear you. So any questions?
Excuse me. Yes.
Presupposes a center which others would fall into, and that in of itself is like exclusion. And I asked someone who was very important to when I heard that stuff, and I just wondered how I would respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point for sure. I suppose I'd respond by sort of channeling the participants a little bit and saying, there were those amongst our participants that would say, no, I don't want to be in those spaces. Like, burn it all down. I want to create new. This is fundamentally unfixable. And then there were those that fell a little bit more towards they're fundamentally problematic. Maybe there are small changes that could be made, and like little by little we could improve, because throwing it all out, burning it all down is probably not going to happen. So I would say both of those viewpoints were represented. I would say both of those viewpoints are probably represented within the research team as well.
Any other questions?
Thanks, Meredith. That was just a really, really beautiful presentation, and nice to see. Like I said, it's a massive project, and it's so nice to see you share it. My question has to do with that loudly misfitting, and you made a comment there about like opportunities for justice or collective action. I kind of get the collective piece on more on like the TikTok, like the hashtag that connects people. But can you give examples of like how people might use loudly misfitting as a way to like network or the collective piece of that?
Well, I mean, I think in a way that's sort of what is happening on TikTok to a degree in certain communities. It's calling attention to the actually, I mean, using the, in the body mapping examples, the words "I belong here," like I have a right to be here, and trying to gain traction through likes or engagement and building followers in order to have a collective online. And I think there's a lot of power in that. It's hard to be an individually isolated activist, right? So to find community is so important. I've thought a lot about how that could be nurtured in non-online spaces. And I think there's room for even social media campaigns that are brought into fitness facilities. We've talked to our stakeholders about what this could look like, right? The Pulse, which is the on-campus gym at McMaster. What could this look like if we have, you know, an Instagram or a TikTok social media campaign that centers bodily difference, so to speak, in movement? And I think there's ways to bring the two together such that they're not so discrete and really powerful, that could be really powerful.
Thanks.
With that said, well, thank you so much, Meredith, for your wonderful talk and for being here with us. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Have a great rest of the weekend. Happy reading break as well. And thanks again for being here. Bye, everyone.